Welcome to Igniting Change, the podcast where we explore innovation, industry trends, and how tech for good is solving the world's biggest challenges. Let's get into it.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much for joining us here today on Igniting Change. I'm really excited to have you hot on the back of a webinar that you were featured on the panel on. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Always. Well, for those listening at home, did you want to introduce yourself? So tell us who you are and what organization you're with.
Sure. So Jamie LeSueur, and thanks Puff and team for having me on today. It's really, it's great. As I was mentioning earlier, it's my first podcast. So I'm very, very happy to get my exposure with you guys. So Jamie LeSueur, I'm head of emergency operations with the International Federation of Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies. And so the HEOPS is the acronym for my position. What we are is standing surge. So when there's ever a large scale emergency operation anywhere in the world where international assistance is requested, myself or my other HEOPS colleagues are called in to lead the operations on behalf of the International Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies.
Amazing. And that sounds like a very important role, but like how did you get into that?
Yeah, it's been a very circuitous route because I started off actually as a jazz musician so many years ago. I went to my undergrad degree as a drummer. And so I went to the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada in -30. It would stay -30 degrees Celsius for months at a time. But yeah, I started off as a jazz musician, and I had a change of heart about halfway through my degree and said, I probably am not good enough to be able to put my children through school on the back of a jazz musician's salary. And so I switched and I joined the Canadian Red Cross as a volunteer and spent a lot of time just doing house fires and local domestic emergency management stuff, and managed to sort of translate it into a job internationally well down the road. But ultimately, it's hard to sort of pinpoint where that began. My parents moved us from suburban Calgary to the border between East and West Jerusalem in Israel, Palestine, in the early 90s. And so we were exposed to living in a dynamic context from a very young age. And funny enough, a little bit of a sidetrack is my best friend from that time also now works for the British government, and he is a humanitarian responder himself. And the last time I saw him was in Turkey following the earthquake in 2023. We were both deployed together through different agencies. So there must have been something in the water way back in the 90s in Israel, Palestine, where we were given the opportunity to then create our spaces and mold them from there.
There must have been something in the water. It's a very small world. And what I found with working with, I guess, international clients or people that work internationally, it's a smaller network. It's surprisingly small, actually. Quite a lot of people know each other that work in this space, which is brilliant. Because it's highly collaborative, in my opinion. But it is, I don't know, I think before I ever thought about it, I just had assumed probably more people, but actually my experience so far has been it's actually quite a fairly small network that do this.
Yeah, what you'll find is there are certain cohorts of international humanitarians that will do the emergency side of things, and then others who might be more within the development sphere or within the climatological sphere or these sort of areas. And we shouldn't be siloing ourselves. But naturally, those people who like to go to emergencies, they tend to stay within a cohort of people that enjoy going to emergencies. And so what you often find is, you'll go to Eastern Congo for an operation and you'll run into someone that you saw back in South Sudan or you saw in another crisis. And, with colleagues from the United Nations and colleagues from other NGOs, sometimes it becomes this sort of node of international responders who go from various operations and see themselves along the way. Because, perhaps there's people that do this that are a little bit crazy themselves and want to go to intense crisis contexts. Where do we sort of get our motivation for it? It's all individualistic. So, what keeps us in the space is entirely individualistic. It would be remiss to say that there wasn't an adventure element that brings a lot of us into it. Like I was saying, there's that cohort of individuals that go from emergency to emergency, but that's not what drives us. I mean, what drives me, and I can talk about myself, there is this intense difference between who I am. I'm a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male from Canada. I had a very supportive upbringing, and there's a massive amount of this world that isn't that lucky. And I remember being confronted with that dynamic on my very first operation in Zimbabwe. And so I was called in as the operations manager for the IFRC, the International Federation. It was a food security crisis. So it was the integrated phase classification system, so IPC phase 3. So it's if it goes from 1 to 5, 5 being famine, it was intense for the people that were living it. It wasn't as bad as it could be naturally, but it was an El Nino induced drought, so a climatological induced drought across all of Southern Africa. And the IFRC launched a massive emergency operation and an appeal for several countries. And I was put in charge of Zimbabwe. And myself and my driver, Fidelis, I still remember him, he's a great guy. We went up to the north of the country to do a food security distribution with the National Society. And on our way back home, we were driving on the road and a bird hit our car and it got stuck in the grill. And so Fide pulled over to the side of the road and we get out of the car to see what's going on, whether or not there's any damage. And it was sort of very an odd experience, but there was a couple tukels, small homes just off to the side of the road. And out of nowhere, this elderly gentleman just shows up. And here we're getting out of our Land Cruiser, we're looking at the bird, and he goes in and gingerly sort of picks this bird out of the front of the grill. And then just out of nowhere, two small children showed up. And so we're looking at him, again, coming from my background, why would you pick roadkill out of the grill? Yeah. And he takes this bird and he hands it over to the two kids. And I looked at Fidelis, my driver, and said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Jamie, this might be the only meat that they'll get in weeks." And for me, it was quite a confronting experience because ultimately, you're not shown your privilege. Sometimes you know that you have your privilege, but you're not shown your privilege. Because if I was in Canada and there was roadkill in the front of my car, the last thing, you'd get a broom and try to pick it out. But ultimately, that's not the experience of a vast majority of people around the world. And I'm not an altruist. And I think anybody who tells you that they are an altruist might have different motivations. But there is a draw to the humanitarian imperative that keeps a lot of us doing what we do. Because when you're confronted with your own privilege, I think there's a real necessity to be honest about how you give back, how you leverage that privilege, because there are so many people that haven't been given that opportunity in life. And that's a little bit what keeps me here, is going back and working in Canada. I find such value in supporting locally led response and supporting people who don't need someone to come in and help them, but need somebody who can complement and augment their domestic response capacity. And for me, it's about being confronted with that privilege and putting it behind to see how maybe I can contribute in a small way to the humanitarian outcomes that we're collectively seeking.
The way that you just framed that so beautifully is absolutely amazing. And it makes complete sense because when you're, I guess, going into situations, you aren't people don't necessarily want you to fix, but you can help be part of the solution, but you're not going to go in and just fix it for people, because also you won't have the local knowledge or insight as to what's actually going on the ground. So that local knowledge is super important, but you framed that so beautifully. I genuinely don't think I've ever heard it framed in that way. It's quite eye-opening, I think. So Jamie, you started your career, you're at the Canadian Red Cross as a volunteer. How has that evolved into overseeing emergency operations globally? How do you go from that to what you're doing now?
A lot of luck, because there's a lot of luck involved. Maybe that's it. It's a lot of luck, and it's not screwing up in particularly public experiences. But maybe sort of the trajectory. It's if there's one thing to sort of for people who are coming up in the careers, I happen to lead the Head of Emergency Operations program for the IFRC, which is a global operational leadership development program. And one thing that I regularly tell the people that are part of that program is just always put your hand up, right? And I was told this by someone much smarter than myself a while ago, But I think this is one of the X factors, right? It's that, in emergency operations around the world and probably in this private sector, we're always looking for the right people to go in and help. And then when you put your hands up to go to Zimbabwe, and my wife and I agree that I'm going to go off for 9 months, and then I get a bit of an operational commission, and I get another job in South Sudan, and we have to agree that I'm going to South Sudan for a year, and she'll be in Nairobi. And then I got a job in Nairobi covering emergency operations for the African continent. But that culminated in 9 months in and out of conflict zones and the Ebola response in Eastern Congo. It's availability, and it's agreeing as a family about what you're willing to put forward to support this work. And I don't think there's any sort of X factor on I'm X smart or this, that, and the other. It's do you have the right sensibilities? Do you have the right humility? Do you have the right competencies? Of course, but are you available to go? And if you're available, it tends to work its way in. You got to get that foot in the door, and that's always the thing with people. But once you're in, if you're going and you put your hand up, it tends to go.
I think there's an element there of, the support that comes from behind the scenes, perhaps from your family, friends that support you doing this, because there's the emotional side of it, but also there's the logistics of things, of like family life and how that works whilst the, you're doing this. Like that I think is so, maybe people don't talk about it as much, but I think it's an incredibly important side of this when you're in this space, for sure.
I mean, so I led the Ebola response in Eastern DRC 3 times between 2018 and 2019. And the very first time I was sent out, I was actually on my way to Indonesia to support a training there. And I got a call from my new boss saying, actually, change your flight. We're sending you to North Kivu, and we're going to send you to Butembo, where the virus, the Ebola virus, is moving south, and that eventually that became the new epicenter of the crisis. But we would like you to open up our base down there. And I didn't tell my parents. Actually, I lied to them. I told them I was going to Mauritania for food insecurity crisis. But 2 weeks in, and we'd had some pretty hairy experiences during those 2 weeks. It was an uptick in the conflict. And obviously Ebola was in the streets, and so it was quite a hectic time. But eventually, my parents called and said, "So Jamie, we know you're not in Mauritania. Where are you?" And so I told them, and you could hear the silence in the room when they learned where I was. And then the next call we had a couple of days later, and this one stuck with me. They said, "We've had a family conference, and we've agreed that if you contract Ebola, your dad and I will come to say goodbye." We don't talk about the impact that this work does have on the people that are behind it.
Yeah.
I'm not military, but there's a similar impact for military personnel. There's an impact for people that do crisis response, police, fire. It's not about the individual always. It's about the support network that is behind them that becomes one of the understated realities of this work. It's not just you that's impacted. It's your whole network. It's the whole ecosystem that surrounds you.
And I feel like as you get further into your career in this space, that gets more complicated because, you might be in a situation where you have dependents, or there's just so many other factors that need to be considered. So it almost becomes harder as you get further through your career. I mean, I can't imagine. I honestly can't imagine. I have 3 children. I find it hard to juggle just day-to-day life. Getting out of bed and getting 3 kids ready in the morning feels hard sometimes. But trying to manage, being away from home, and
Yeah.
like,
So, I mean,
wow.
if us internationals are one side of the equation, the other equation is the people that live in those contexts. And again, I mean, I'll use Ebola regularly in this conversation because it was such a prolific experience. But we had one volunteer who was a logistics volunteer for the Red Cross of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he lived up in North Kivu. And I learned that his salary is commensurate within Eastern Congo, but it's a few dollars a day, to be frank. It's not a lot. And he's been employed through the Ebola response. And what he did was, because he also volunteered as a safe and dignified burials volunteer, what he would do is he would rent another home so that if he contracted the virus, he wouldn't bring it home to his family. And so on $10 a day, because that was the volunteer pay for safe and dignified burials, he spent a good portion of that making sure that his family was safe in case he got sick. And this, I mean, me, I'm fortunate. I come in and I come out, and there's impacts on my family, no question. That's the difference between international and local responders, is that they live there. They're not leaving. There's no evacuation plan. And I mean, for me, this became, again, being confronted with my own privilege. The reality of that is that he was so dedicated to volunteering to support his community that the small amount of money that he was accruing from volunteering and supporting us, he was willing to put a portion of that aside to protect his family so he can continue to volunteer. I mean, that's humanitarianism. I sit in conference rooms, I write a lot of emails. That volunteer, that's a humanitarian. And I think, as we sort of go down this pathway and collectively we're moving towards a more localized response, it's remembering that those people who are out there living it, breathing it, well before any internationals get there and long after, they're the ones that are at the heart of humanitarian work.
And they're who we should be shining a light on more, because I think it's hearing those stories and hearing those examples that kind of makes us stop in our tracks and realize, what? It almost gives me more hope that there are good people out there and they're doing incredible things.
So ultimately, what's been ubiquitous across most emergency management or emergencies and crises that I've been part of has been this element of community resilience. And my very first operation, which I wasn't managing, but I happened to be affected myself. And so the highway was destroyed on both sides of us. And ultimately, I was the only Red Cross responder in this town, and therefore I took on a leadership role. But ultimately, what you saw there was communities coming together, of course, right? Because you're impacted together. But then we heard the mayor of Calgary, which is where I grew up, a day after this flood, the size of Tunisia, I believe, hit southern Alberta. He put out a call saying, everybody come to the football stadium who wants to volunteer. Great. There were 6,000 volunteers of people that themselves had been affected that came to McMahon Stadium to sign up to support the community. And ultimately, our home in Calgary was destroyed, or at least the basement was destroyed, but we had people coming out and digging out our basement to help us out. That was my first sort of window into this community that comes together, that bands together in a crisis. But pulling it out of Canada, you see it in every single emergency operation that I've ever worked on. In the Turkey earthquake, communities will come together to help each other out. It's this social contract that nobody writes about. I mean, it's been talked about several times in academic literature and the rest, but when you're faced that's what gives you hope. Despite the challenges that we have in the world, this community element that shows its greatest value when you are at the hardest part, the hardest time, that's ubiquitous. And I've seen it everywhere.
And that's so inspiring and encouraging to hear. So I feel like that's amazing. Managing or supporting a lot of people during a crisis is a very hard thing to do. But how is your work using technology to make a difference? Does technology help in those cases, or can it hinder? I feel like it's going to be able to do both, genuinely. How is the technology used to make a difference?
That's a good question. I mean, ultimately, what do we see in the movies? We see in the movies, big screens, and everyone's got a laptop or an iPad, and satellites, and there's drones everywhere, and this, that, and the other. And I've seen that, right? So the Turkish Red Crescent, following the earthquake in 2023, they have a central command center in Ankara. It's amazing. It's 30 screens. They're tracking over 700 different partners who are distributing food, because they're the food coordinating agency for government. And they're able to see on a live map who's doing what where. And by the end of it, they were also an implementing agency, but they helped coordinate and deliver themselves millions and millions of meals quickly. They had their first community food kitchen up within 4 hours of the earthquake happening. Right?
Oh my gosh!
Oh, it's unbelievable. unbelievable organization, the Turkish Red Crescent. But they were fast, and then they were able to visualize everything in live at a central command center. This is unique. It doesn't always happen like this. And in fact, I've been doing a little bit of research for the IFRC on operations within the last few years and what are sort of the big mega trends that we're seeing in emergency operations around the world. What has uniquely come up in this is that when you look at all the recommendations that have been in the end of mission reports and final evaluations, if you consolidate them, digital is coming up as one of the largest asks of our national societies around the world, that they want to enhance their digital capabilities. Now, having the big screens is definitely down the road, but what they're asking more for is the simple stuff. Does the branch have access to internet at a reasonable price that doesn't cost them $50 a megabyte?
Yeah.
Does the branch have access to laptops? Are they able to have a volunteer management system across the entire country so they know who's working for them, how to mobilize them, how to pay them, if they get a per diem because they're working? All these sort of the basics are really quite critical. I mean, it's great to have the big stuff and the satellites and the drones, but when you sort of peel back the layers around the world, it's the essentials that are the most important to most of our national societies. Because if you can't write an email, or if you can't access the internet, then it limits you from not only responding, but connecting with the wider world, positioning the operation, and making sure that you get access to the funding to keep on responding.
So it's like that foundation. You need a solid foundation before you're able to do that stuff, But I guess it's going to be much harder in some places than others.
Precisely. I mean, this is where a tailored approach for any international organization comes in, right? There's no standard set of tools that you can give to every national society or every local organization. You have to work with them. You have to understand their digital transformation journey. I was in South Sudan this time last year, where one of the main wishes of the National Society and the South Sudan Red Cross was just that: internet, computers, making sure that all of their people who were working in some of the hardest conditions around the world had access to the basics and the foundations of digital literacy and information technology so they could be part of it as a connected network, right? And that became our job, is then how do we get the money to make sure that they can do this? Because if the future is about a real sort of integrated digital world, getting the basics right is almost the most important thing. All those screens can come later.
Well, they have to come later because you have to have that foundation in place. Otherwise, that stuff doesn't work or it's irrelevant, because it's like, this stuff's fundamental. Like, we need this stuff before we can do that stuff. But I just, trying to line that up isn't going to be easy, like, depending on where you're at. Talk to me about the Ukraine war, because I understand that I think you mentioned it on the webinar as well, but there was an example where you guys pushed innovation, like how you use data differently. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, what's the most important thing when you're part of a crisis is to make sure that you're pushing the envelope, because every crisis is unique, right? Ultimately, it's its own ecosystem, it's its own environment, and you can't carbon copy or just put the same thing you did over here and put it on this and hope it works. That's not the way crises function. And so when you have the opportunity of a crisis, because that's a way to look at them as well, is it's not just a disaster, it's an opportunity. Then how do you move the needle as a collective? Because doing it in peacetime is always more difficult. And so one of the things that we were able to do it was an 8-country response, Ukraine obviously being the most important component, but then we had people fleeing from the east of Ukraine over the borders into Hungary, to Poland and Slovakia. So how do we make sure that that 8-country operation had access to the right technology to support people on the move? And what do people need when they're on the move? Well, what they don't need, I can tell you, is a bucket. They don't need a big blanket, because when you're fleeing your home, you're bringing with you the most important things, and that's already weighing you down. And I remember being on the border between Ukraine and Slovakia, and ultimately seeing well-dressed people, I mean, better dressed than myself, but pushing shopping carts over the border because there had been kilometers and kilometers of lines of cars. And some people just decided that they'd come back to the cars and let's get over the border now, because at the beginning it was just hectic. And so you find these poor individuals who are fleeing from conflict and the potential of conflict with everything they own. These are humans, and they are there, and when you witness this, again, you're confronted with your own humanity, but ultimately they don't need another thing to carry in this. And so what we wanted to do is ensure that we had a cash response. And a cash response, because it's multimodal, and ultimately it can be used to buy a blanket if you need a blanket when you get to wherever you're going, or it can be used to purchase food or whatever it is. Ultimately, we wanted to make sure that we had a cash response that could go to scale quickly to support these people as they were moving over the borders, as they were going further into Europe and further into the rest of the continent, where they might stay temporarily or they might stay for longer terms. And so one of the taskings that we received was, how do you get a cash response into all 8 countries and scale it up simultaneously in the midst of a massive conflict, escalation? Because the conflict started years before, but this was an escalation in the conflict. And so I had 8 emergency operations managers that were part of my team, 1 in each of the countries. And the task was innovate, be a bit flexible, work with your national societies, and come back with an answer about how you can do this. And you'd find some national societies that would be more traditional, who want the standard phone, mobile money sort of distribution. You'd have some that would have physical points where they would step up, and then you'd hand over cash in envelopes, or you'd hand over vouchers. But in Romania, our team decided that they were going to take a different approach. And ultimately, that approach was to say, well, everyone has a phone. And if everybody's got a phone, then ultimately that gives us access to everyone. They don't have to come to a central point to then register and write down their name and tell us what they need. What we can do is we can come to them if they self-register. And ultimately, this became, I think, the first time that we built an app, but that in a humanitarian response, where people were given the ability to then download an app, self-register, get checked online, put their ID on it, and then be validated and then receive assistance on their phone. Because the last thing you want to do, again, if you're holding everything that you own on you, the last thing you want to do is have to go 15 kilometers in that direction to go and find a point where you have to write down your name. And you do that in one country, and if you move to the next country, you got to do it again and again and again and again. And you have to sign the same forms over and over and over. And it's really undignified. So what we were given was this opportunity using tech to better serve people by responding more to their dignity as humans than anything else. And so Access RC is ultimately the app that came as a result of this. It's been able since then to deliver over 85 million Swiss francs in cash assistance. We've got hundreds of thousands of downloads of it. It works on 54 languages around the world, and we're trying to push it to become one of the tools to deliver cash at scale in crises of the future. And if we can do it well, then what we do is we move beyond just cash, but we can also say, how do we do a survey? We hear there's a hurricane coming or there's a cyclone coming. We can notify you in advance. Do you need shelter kits? Do you need access, or do you need information about your local branch? So all of a sudden it becomes a one-stop shop for everything that somebody might need. And if they go over a border or if they go into another community, they don't have to find us. We can help to find them. And that's the most important.
What an incredible example. That's actually amazing. And the fact that it was born out of like a real genuine need. But I love the way that you were framing, the crisis as an opportunity as well. And that is an incredible example of innovating, but also then continuously improving, because it's scaling, right? It's being used by more people in more places, and just amazing. And I guess when you have a product born that way, I don't know, oh God, it's a hard one, I think, to get your head around, because you're responding to a crisis, but knowing that this could be used in the future, and this could affect, and could be maybe used in different ways and for different reasons. So it's wild to think about it like that, because I would imagine, someone that doesn't work in this space every day, someone like myself, I'd be like, oh, so you're innovating for this particular situation. But actually there is a lens of this of, well, we might need to be able to push this forward at some point outside of this situation.
Yeah.
But I think when it's born out of the here and now, it's a very closed thing, but it's wonderful. So this came out of Romania, but then the other countries? Were they inspired? Was it something that they could do? It was.
I mean, it wasn't overnight, let's be
Yeah.
frank. And these
Yeah.
things, they take a while to scale. And I mean, since then, we put a lot of research and development into building the team that can do this at scale. But within 10 days of us launching in Romania, we had, I think it was 60,000 downloads of the app or something like this. So it really took off in Romania, and you could see this sort of bubble of we got a map going up. You could just see it sort of spread across. And then, yeah, it moved around, and all of a sudden that became our approach. The reality is though, there's I mean, if within a social welfare context, there's also the legislative environment that's important to consider. That, our job is auxiliary to domestic authorities. We support national governments in their own responses. And when it comes to long-term social welfare, we want to make sure that the Red Cross is there as auxiliary, but not replacing government, and ultimately making sure that there's a complementary response to that of government. And so having the negotiations to also figure out how do we, within the context of a country-led response, how do we augment a cash operation? That also becomes it becomes a point of discussion that has to happen. And sometimes that can take a long time and sometimes it's quicker. But the reality is that it's part of an ecosystem. Now, the Red Cross doesn't operate independently. We don't. We are an independent organization, but we are within an ecosystem. And
Yeah, you have to
ultimately,
work together.
we have to work together with those who are on the ground.
Right. So, Jamie, where is humanitarian tech heading? Like, what's missing? Where does it need to go?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And if I was a tech person, I'd have probably a better answer for you. But what I can say is emergency operations are a function of trust, ultimately. And I've led a couple public health emergencies. I was fortunate enough at the beginning of COVID to be given the reins to support the continental response in Africa for the IFRC. But also, I've been in the field in Ebola, working directly with people who are affected. And regardless if you're at the most local level or if you're at the regional level, continental, the efficacy of a public health emergency is whether or not the community has trust in what you're doing. And this is a roundabout way to answer your question. But in Ebola, for instance, we were in charge of safe and dignified burials. The National Society was in the lead, obviously, and us as the Red Cross, our job was to safely and effectively bury those who were suspected or positive cases of Ebola, because that is now proven to be one of the core transmission chains in an Ebola outbreak. But the reality is that when you do it, you are space suited up, right? You've got plastic all over the place. You've got a big helmet on. It's 40 degrees, so the people inside are sweltering. But to anyone who is within the communities, all you see are 4 land cruisers pulling up and people in spacesuits coming out, and ultimately then going into your home and starting to ask you questions about the person you love. And have you cared for this person? And who did they touch? And this, that, and the other. And the question comes back is, have you touched them? And then, of course, you say yes, because that's my mother we're talking about, for instance. And then you're brought into the space and you're told, okay, you can suit up with us. You're going to be part of the burial. This is how it's going to work. And we're going to work this together. And you've got people who are explaining things all over the place, but ultimately you're not really hearing anything because you're going through one of the most traumatic experiences of your life. And there's a person in a spacesuit that's there trying to tell you why this is important. I mean, this comes back to the awful reality of Ebola. It's because it's a virus that's spread through love. Ultimately, when you care for those that you love, that's how the virus is propagated. And that's the horrific part of Ebola. But it's added when you've got someone in your home who you don't understand. And so in October of 2018, we had 28% of our of alerts for community deaths. That is someone who died outside of a hospital in the community areas. 28% of those alerts were coming to the Red Cross. And a lot of the viral transmission chains were happening out in the community. So those are the ones you really want to know so that you don't have different nodes of transmission popping up. 6 months later, when we changed our approach to focus on building specific community trust with specific cohorts of the community. So the motor taxi unions, for instance, that really thought that we were there to propagate Ebola business and that we were infecting people and that we had some part of Ebola business. When we focused on building messages for them, that helped to alleviate those fears and tell the communities why the spacesuit was necessary. 6 months later, what we saw was over 80% of community deaths being reported to the Red Cross, because this is a function of community trust, because you would never call someone to come in a spacesuit unless you trusted what they were doing. Now, how does this link to tech? When you don't have community trust, then you have the alternative, which is when our staff were being attacked directly. And I took over the operation in early October 2018. And the day I took it over, 2 of our volunteers were attacked by a mob. They were in the same spacesuits. But naturally, the community was terrified. But then we were able to move to a level where we never achieved community trust, let's be frank. But ultimately, when we were able to move from 28 to 80%, you were able to operate a bit more safely. You were able to do the job. And when you can, then the epidemiological curve goes down. The same thing in COVID, mask hesitancy, vaccine hesitancy. If you don't have trust in the interventions, then all of a sudden it's a security issue for the people who are responding, and the epidemiological curves can't come under. The reality about tech, though, is that artificial intelligence gives the world access to the ability to build trust or detract from it. And misinformation and disinformation at scale, deep fakes, the rest of it is an avenue that people can use to vehemently oppose interventions that would save their lives. And this isn't a comment about what those interventions are, but it is to say that ultimately, if we are not careful in how we use artificial intelligence and how we manage ourselves in a responsible framework of misinformation and disinformation, humanitarian responders will continue to face increases in community mistrust, which ultimately will hurt the people we're trying to help. And that, I think, will be one of the most important things that we can collectively come together, is how do we responsibly use artificial intelligence at scale in emergencies to facilitate work, not to pull it away.
Yeah, I don't think I could agree with you any more. And you know what, Jamie? I'm not even going to touch the other 2 questions, because I feel like we need to end with that, because I've not had anyone, certainly not in my interviews, talk about the trust element. Like, it's such an important part, but actually it's just working with tech, because without that trust, the tech's irrelevant. Like, people just aren't gonna trust. So Jamie, thank you so much. We really appreciate the time, effort and energy. And we know that you have potential travel coming up for the next crisis that you'll be focused on. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.